This afternoon, we move beyond Kant's transcendental aesthetic to the transcendental analytic. And if that complicated vocabulary has registered in your consciousness, you'll recognize that that means we're moving from his examination of the preconditions that make possible sense perception to consideration of the preconditions that make possible conceptual understanding and judgments. The transcendental aesthetic is about sense perception, and the transcendental method that he's employing is simply the procedure of bracketing all particulars within the experience, the content of the experience, so as to identify the universal structure of perceptual experience, which is characteristic regardless of all the variables of particular experiences. And you recall that he finds that the two forms of sense perception, space, that is to say, we see things in three-dimensional ways, and time, experience comes to us sequentially in time. And the study simply of those pure forms is what gives rise to mathematics. Geometry, the science of space, and arithmetic, the science of numbered sequences, the sequentiality of time. Well, Kant has also told us, you remember, that percepts without universal concepts of some sort are blind. It's not enough for you to say, blue patch now, and I add patch and now to get the space-time qualities of it. The forms. Blue patch now, if that's all you say, somebody will say, what on earth are you trying to say? Because you're not affirming anything of anything. You're not interpreting the blue patch now in any way. So the understanding of our experience, the interpretation of perceptual experience, requires that we call on more abstract general concepts in talking about it. And in the transcendental analytic, he is after those abstract concepts which are the necessary prerequisites for interpretive understanding of what we experience. Just as the forms, structure, perception, so the categories of understanding give structure to our understanding. Okay? And so we want to get at these categories. Now, as we get at them, keep in mind the comparison with Aristotle's categories that I mentioned a couple of days ago. Aristotle identified 10 categories of thought that are also categories of being. Kant identifies 12 categories of thought, but he does not know that they are categories of being. Keep that difference in mind. His categories are really Newtonian categories. So the outcome of this is to conclude the Newtonian science is dealing only with subjective structures of our thinking, the way we structure the world. rather than with the way the world objectively is. In today's parlance, he is not a realist about science, but an anti-realist about science. Science does not tell us about reality. It tells us only about phenomena. And one other thing to notice, that when he does present to us his categories, they come in 4 groups of 3. 4 triads. And some historians have pointed out that this is the beginning of the Hegelian dialectic, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, structuring all thought, and for Hegel, all being. You see? When we get to Hegel, we'll trace out his triads, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, concepts, categories. But Kant's 12 categories come in that triadic form, though he doesn't see it as a dialectic. He doesn't think of that. That comes later with Hegel. Now, the way in which he gets at them, identifies what the categories are, is really very straightforward. If these are the ways in which we understand things, the ways in which we classify things, if you like, the way in which we classify our experiences, then it's natural that if you can lay out a classification of different kinds of judgment we make, that those judgments are likely to embody the a priori categories. And of course that's precisely what he does. So that if you look on pages 388 and 389, and I hope you brought your Kaufman. If not, look at somebody else's. Pages 388, 389, you notice that at the top of 388, he represents under 4 heads 12 different logical kinds of judgments. And as you look over them, you'll think that he's perhaps taken this from an introductory logic textbook like perhaps you used in Logic 243. Because the quantity of judgments represent 3 kinds that we talk about in ordinary logic, Aristotelian logic. There are universal judgments, particular judgments, singular judgments. Universal judgments, all men are mortal. Particular judgments, some are. Singular judgments, this one, Socrates, is. So these are 3 different quantitative categories. Okay? Then look at quality. Affirmative and negative. Or indefinite. The term infinite doesn't seem quite to fit. Indefinite. Yes or no? Maybe. Affirmative and negative. All A's are B. No A's are B. Affirmative, negative. Okay? The relational judgments we make. In logic, we speak of a categorical judgment. All men are mortal. A hypothetical judgment. If you're a cretin, you're a liar. And a disjunctive judgment. Either you are or you're not. And those of you who've gotten some introduction to logical symbolism recognize that those are the 3 kinds of things that we identify in a symbolic form, so that P and Q is a conjunction of 2 things. You see, P horseshoe Q is the hypothetical. If P, then Q. And P wedge Q is the disjunct, either or. You see? So logical form, he's talking about the logical form of judgments. And then the modality, once again, something is problematic, or it's simply asserted, or it's apodictic, that is to say it's demonstrably necessary. So modality would say it may be, it is, it must be, you see. And we get that even in the moods of verbs in the study of language. It may be subjunctive, may be optative. It is the indicative, and then it must be third way. So each of them has its own form, its own structure, its own logic, you see. Each of them embodies some abstract idea in addition to the particular subject matter of the judgment. Now, what are those abstract ideas, those categories? And you get that at the bottom of 389, where he identifies the categories assumed in the judgments. Categories, again, of quantity, quality, relation, modality. You don't need to memorize the 12, but get those 4 at least straight. Quantity, quality, relation, modality. The idea of a unity, of a plurality, of a totality. Those are abstract ideas. The idea of, under relation, substance and accidents. Yes, the accident that inheres in the substance, the quality, the substance-quality distinction. Cause and effect, and reciprocity, both cause and effect. So the concept of cause and effect, which he told us he was after, comes right there. It's an a priori concept. And then under modality, things like contingency and necessity, possibility and necessity, existence. These are categories that go, in a way, all the way back to Aristotle's thinking, very much embedded in Newtonian and Lockean thinking. And they are things which Hume was quite skeptical about as far as knowledge of them in an empirical or a priori basis. So that's the way in which he gets at them. It's pretty straightforward. Now, before we go further, however, I want you to notice one thing else that he says on 388 and 389.